This video contains a full-length case interview that you can do on your own without a case interview partner. This case comes from Hacking the Case Interview's comprehensive online course. So if you find this case interview exercise helpful, check out our full case interview course, which teaches insider case interview strategies and contains 20 practice cases like this one. Before we begin, please take a quick second to give this video a like to help support the channel. Let's start. Medicine Company is a pharmaceutical company that develops and manufactures many different prescription drugs. This year, they just received Federal Drug Administration or FDA approval for a new drug Hypertose to treat high blood pressure, also known as hypertension. This drug is different from other high blood pressure drugs in that it is preventative, meant to be taken before someone develops high blood pressure rather than being taken to treat symptoms of high blood pressure once someone has already developed it. The drug is targeted for individuals that are high risk, determined by family history, diet, and lifestyle. Medicine Company has hired us to determine how to increase patient adoption of this drug once it is launched. Pause the video now to structure your framework to answer this question. Here is a transcript for your reference. Here is how one potential framework could look like. In this framework, we had to use the Create Your Own bucket, particularly looking at the stakeholders involved in increasing drug adoption. First, we want to look at patients to see how we can increase adoption among them. We would look into things like raising awareness among patients and creating patient advocates for the drug. Second, we'd want to look at physicians to see how we can increase adoption among them. Similarly, we'd look into how to raise awareness among physicians and how to create physician advocates. Third, we'd look into insurers. We want to make sure the drug is covered by insurers and that insurers are advocates for the drug. Finally, we want to look at Medicine Company's capabilities to ensure that there are no capability bottlenecks. We'd look into making sure they can supply enough quantity of drug and that they are able to deliver the drug on time. Why would insurers or insurance companies want to cover Hypertose? Pause the video now to answer this question. We can answer this question by first understanding how insurers make money. They charge a recurring fee to patients in exchange for providing health insurance that covers the costs of treatments of health issues. If insurers don't cover Hypertose, then they would be paying for the treatment of all people with hypertension. If they cover Hypertose, they would be paying for Hypertose as well as covering the remaining people that have hypertension. Therefore, insurers would cover Hypertose only if it saves them money by decreasing the incidence of hypertension among patients, thus decreasing their treatment costs. If covering Hypertose costs $5,000 per year per high-risk individual, 1. How much would it cost insurers to not cover Hypertose and treat hypertension? 2. How much would it cost insurers to cover Hypertose and treat hypertension? Assume the following. There are 300 million people in the US, and 1 in 3 people have hypertension. 2 in 3 people in the US are at risk of hypertension, of which 1 in 4 of those are high risk. Treating someone with hypertension costs $10,000 per year. Hypertose is 80% effective at preventing hypertension. The other 20% of the time, the patient will still develop hypertension and cost $10,000 per year to treat. Pause the video now to answer these questions. Let's start by calculating how much it costs if insurers don't cover Hypertose and treat everyone that has hypertension. We are told that there are 300 million people in the US and that 1/3 have hypertension, giving us 100 million people in the US with hypertension. Hypertension costs $10,000 a year to treat, so that gives us a total of 100 million people times $10,000, or 1,000 billion or $1 trillion in costs. Next, let's calculate how much it would cost insurers to cover hypertose and then treat the remaining people that have hypertension. Let's first calculate how much hypertose costs to cover. There are 300 million people in the US, and 2/3 are at risk of hypertension. And among those, 1/4 are at high risk and would take hypertose. This gives us 50 million people that would be taking hypertose. Covering hypertose costs $5,000 per patient per year, giving us $250 billion in costs to cover hypertose. Next, we need to calculate the cost of treating those that take hypertose but do not find success. Remember that hypertose is only 80% effective. Therefore, 20% times 50 million hypertose users gives us 10 million people that would still develop hypertension after taking hypertose. Multiplying this by the cost of treatment of $10,000 per year per patient, this gives us a cost of $100 billion. Finally, we need to calculate the cost of treating the remaining people with hypertension. Remember that 100 million people have hypertension, but only 50 million take hypertose. We need to calculate the cost of treatment for the remaining 50 million people with hypertension that do not take hypertose. 50 million people times $10,000 gives us a cost of $500 billion. Adding these costs together, $250 billion plus $100 billion plus $500 billion, total costs of covering hypertose is $850 billion. This is lower than the cost of not covering hypertose. Therefore, by covering hypertose, insurance companies can save $150 billion a year. How much could medicine company increase hypertose's price such that insurance companies would still choose to cover the drug? Pause the video now to answer this question. Remember that hypertose has an 80% success rate of saving insurers $10,000 per year per patient in treatment costs. Therefore, the expected value of savings that hypertose provides insurers is $8,000 per year per patient. As long as we price hypertose less than $8,000 per year, insurers would want to cover hypertose since it would still be saving them money. Do you think it is better to focus on targeting patients or targeting physicians to increase adoption of the drug? Pause the video now to answer the question. Let's think about this in terms of ease of targeting and effectiveness for both patients and physicians. Looking at ease of targeting for patients, there are a high number of patients to target, but it is relatively easy to run ads targeting this large audience by running television ads, for example. For effectiveness, there is generally a low bar to convince patients to use your drug, and patients can ask physicians to prescribe them hypertose. Looking at physicians, there are a fewer number of physicians than patients, and it is more difficult targeting them. You can't just run television ads. For effectiveness, there is generally a higher bar to convince physicians to prescribe a drug. However, patients listen to physicians for their advice on which drug to take, and physicians have the ultimate power to prescribe. Therefore, we can make the argument that targeting physicians is more effective, but requires more effort. You could have also recommended focusing on patients, as long as you had some rationale or reasons to justify it. In summary, how should medicine company focus on increasing drug adoption of hypertose? Pause the video now to deliver your recommendation. Here is how one potential recommendation could look like. I recommend that medicine company increase patient adoption of hypertose by targeting insurers as the first priority and physicians as a second priority for the following 3 reasons. 1. Targeting insurers is critical because if they don't cover hypertose, then patients cannot afford to take the drug. 2. We should be able to convince insurers to cover hypertose if we price the drug less than $8,000 per patient. This way, insurers are incentivized to cover hypertose since it lowers their total cost of treating patients with hypertension. 3. We should target physicians because they have the actual power to prescribe the drug to patients, and patients listen to the advice from their doctors. For next steps, I'd like to look into 2 areas. 1. Determine the best way to market Hypertos to physicians. And 2. Ensure that medicine company can supply enough drug to meet demand.